Hey, what's going on everybody? It's ETA Prime back here again. Today I am super excited because we're going to be taking a look at an ultra small Ryzen Powered x86 single board computer. And in fact, it's actually a bit smaller than the Raspberry Pi 4. This is from a company called DFI and it's known as the EC90AGH. You can actually get the board by itself. They do have a few different variants. Or you can go with their package deal and get something they're calling the Pi Box, which comes with a nice little case, a few adapters, and a heatsink for this Ryzen embedded APU. And the version we're going to be taking a look at in this video has their most powerful CPU offering. It's using the AMD Ryzen embedded R1606G. We'll get into the full specs in a second, but I did want to take a look at the I/O. So this is actually meant to be an embedded board for robotics and machinery, but it doesn't mean we can't do some pretty cool stuff with it. In this video, we'll definitely be testing out some games, some emulation, some web browsing, and some video playback. But let's go ahead and jump right down into it. As you can see, we get gigabit Ethernet, a USB Type-C port, and this is actually USB 3.1, but unfortunately it does not support display out. We can transfer data over this, but they did leave us with two micro HDMI ports, and this is HDMI 1.4. It uses 12 volts to power the whole unit up, and the highest wattage that I've seen pulled out of this board from the wall is 22 watts, so you could get away running this with a battery. We've got our power input over here, and it does come with a locking barrel jack. We've got a mini PCIe slot up here, and the kit actually comes with a 4G module, but you could always opt for Bluetooth and Wi-Fi if you needed to. On the bottom here, we have our RAM chips, our storage, and our APU. This does support a CMOS battery because basically this is just a tiny PC, so we do have a real BIOS that we can access. So by itself, it's actually smaller than the Raspberry Pi 4, but with this APU, you're definitely going to want to run some type of heatsink. Now, the kit that they include their heatsink with is totally silent, so it's a passive heatsink, but it does make the unit much larger than the Pi 4. But when it comes to the board size itself, as you can see, it's a bit smaller. And give you a quick look here at the heatsink and the case that they've included with it. We also have that 4G module. I'm not going to be using cellular on this, but we've got the case, which just kind of wraps around that heatsink. And the heatsink is more than enough for this APU. I've run some really hardcore tests on this thing, and the highest temperatures that I've seen out of it was 81 degrees Celsius, and this thing thermal throttles at 87. So now, getting down to the specs of this little board. For the CPU, or the APU, we have the AMD Ryzen embedded R1606G. 2 cores, 4 threads, base clock of 2.6 GHz with a boost up to 3.5. Built-in Radeon 3 graphics at 1200 MHz, 4 GB of LPDDR4 running at 2400 MHz, 64 GB of internal storage, but they do offer a 128 GB model. And this will run Linux or Windows. It actually came pre-installed with Windows 10 Enterprise, but I upgraded to Windows 10 Pro on this unit just so we could get some gaming out of the way and I could install all of the applications I wanted to test. So real quick, I just installed the heatsink here and it sits in here really nicely. We've got that little copper plate that makes contact with the aluminum, so it's not going to overheat. And once we put everything inside of it and button it up, as you can see, it does get a bit bigger than the Raspberry Pi 4, but this is still a very, very small PC. And I'm sure you could get the size down by using active cooling, but we have passive cooling here, and like I mentioned, this is made for embedded projects, which usually run 24/7. And with this heatsink, I haven't seen it overheat once, even stressing out the CPU and GPU to 100%. So I've just went ahead and plugged in my HDMI and power. It's running on 12 volts. Now, we only have that USB Type-C for data transfer, so I do need to use an adapter. This will just give me 2 more USB 3.0 ports. That way I can go ahead and plug in a mouse and keyboard very easily. So I've been really impressed by how snappy this little thing is, even running Windows 10, which can be a RAM hog, and we're only working with 4 gigs on this board. As you can see, it is running at 2400 MHz, but it's in single channel. We've also got those built-in Radeon 3 graphics up to 1200 MHz. And it might not sound like a lot for a desktop PC, but for a single board computer, this thing is actually putting down some really good power. So the very first thing I wanted to take a look at was a little bit of web browsing and 4K video playback. It actually does a really good job. I'm plugged in over Ethernet right now because I don't have the Wi-Fi module. You could always use a USB Wi-Fi module if you want to, but over Ethernet, you're definitely going to get the best performance, and this thing is really, really snappy. So I'm going to go ahead and load up a 4K 60 video here. We'll go with Big Buck Bunny. We'll get it full screen, make sure we're at 4K, and I'll turn Stats for Nerds on. So we have that running up in the top left-hand corner. We've got our frame counter, so we see if we drop any frames. And I've already tested a couple 4K 60 videos. Most I've had drop in a 5-minute video was 19 frames, which really isn't that bad. And just starting this out, we're only at 2 drop frames. So yeah, this thing can definitely handle 4K video playback, and if we can do that, we'll do 720 and 1080 60 just fine. And by the way, while running this 4K video, it's only pulling 12 watts from the wall according to my kilowatt meter. But yeah, I mean, it's really not meant to do things like this, but as you can see, it definitely will. This is for embedded projects, more of the robotic side of things, maybe some telecommunications. You could use something like this for signage, since we do have those 2 displays out on this unit. Or you could just virtually do more displays if you need to. So for web browsing, email checking, video playback, even up to 4K, this little board's working much better than I ever thought it would. Now, one thing I always like to do with these machines is run some benchmarks, and I just went through a couple, and then we're going to jump into some PC gaming, because even with that, I was pretty surprised by what we have here. First up, we have Geekbench 5 coming in with a single core score of 613, multi 1371. In the grand scale of things, this is still on the lower end, but for its size and power consumption, I think it came out with some decent scores here. And the other benchmark I ran was 3D Mark Wildlife. This just tests the Vulkan performance of the built-in GPU. We got a total score of 2,164. So these benchmarks aren't stellar, but given what this thing is, I think it's doing a pretty decent job. So when it comes to PC gaming, I did go with some older stuff because after all, it is a lower end board, but after seeing the performance out of these 2 games that I tested, I think we could do a little better in some higher end games. I will do another video if anybody's interested, but first up we have Left 4 Dead 2. We're at medium settings, 720p, we got an average of 72 FPS out of this, and I'd say it's definitely playable on this unit. So when it comes to Skyrim, I was actually really surprised. I completely understand that this is an older game, but I like testing this on iGPUs, especially lower end boards because it is such an older game. Most of the time, I can't get 60 out of it, at least on the Intel iGPUs, but with this little single board computer, we were able to get a pretty good frame rate out of this. We do get some dips under 60, we're at 720p low, but to see this running on a board this small is really impressive in my opinion. Now it's time to move over to some emulation, and we're going to start out a bit light here with PSP using the standalone version of PPSSPP, Vulkan backend, 3x resolution with Pro Street. We're running at 30, and that's exactly what it ran at on the original PSP hardware. There are hacks out there to get this up to 60, but seeing how well this ran at 3x, I figured I'd go ahead and test a harder one to run, and that's going to be Chains of Olympus. And to my surprise, Vulkan back in 3x, it runs Chains of Olympus at full speed. I did get a few dips every once in a while, but even on higher end hardware, I still get dips. But yeah, I mean, at 3x with this little board running Chains of Olympus, if you do any kind of emulation, you know how hard this can be on low end hardware. This is really good performance. So after seeing how well PSP performed on this, I figured we'd go ahead and take it up a notch to PS2. So here we have the standalone version of PCSX2, DirectX 11 backend, native resolution, Tekken 5, and unfortunately it's just a bit hard pressed to run like this, but if I turn on some more hacks we can get this to run at 60. Unfortunately it does get a bit choppy like that. But it is doable with this game if you don't mind a bunch of hacks running in the background. Now another one I tested is a bit easier to emulate. Here's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 for PS2. Vulkan back in, native resolution, we're at a constant 60. So yeah, obviously there are some PS2 games that this little board can run at full speed, but I wouldn't expect it to do Shadow of the Colossus at full speed, even with a bunch of hacks on. But one emulator that I tested that performed way better than I thought was the Dolphin emulator for Gamecube and Wii. Here we have Automodalista, which is one of my go-to tests. Vulkan back in, native resolution, I didn't see it dip one time, not even in the menus with this one. It's definitely trucking along, and this is only using about 8 watts of power from the wall. That's with the CPU wattage and the GPU wattage included. So yeah, it's performing really well with GameCube using the Dolphin emulator. And the final thing I tested, at least for this video, was some Wii emulation with the Dolphin emulator. So we're still at the native resolution. Sonic Colors, which ran at 30 FPS on the original hardware, is also really doable. Got a couple dips here and there, but I think that shader cache going on in the background. Overall, really impressed with the GameCube and Wii performance out of this tiny board. I always like to take a look at total system power consumption. So through all of my testing, I had this plugged into a kilowatt meter at the wall. In sleep mode, it pulls about 1.2 watts, but we're not doing anything there. Idle, it's at 8 watts, and I gotta say, it's kind of in a ready state when it's at idle, at least when you're set in high performance mode from Windows settings, because when I was doing my web browsing and 4K video playback, it only jumped up to 12 watts, but the maximum that I could get this to pull from the wall while maxing out the CPU and GPU was 23 watts. So it's definitely a low-powered single-board computer, and with figures like this, and given the fact that it does run on 12 volts, you could get away by running this on battery power no problem. And when it comes to CPU temps, I'd never hit thermal throttle while doing any of my testing. Now, it's totally possible to hit thermal throttle, but you will have to stress out that CPU for over 30 minutes straight. And through all of my testing, the highest temperatures that I saw was 78 degrees Celsius. So this cooler is definitely doing its job. And remember, if you wanted to go active cooling, you could keep it down even more. So yeah, in the end, this is definitely a powerful little x86 single board computer, but they don't come in cheap. They're not anywhere close to the price of the Raspberry Pi, and it's really hard to compare it to the Pi except for, size-wise. These are designed for industrial embedded applications, but when I got my hands on it, we definitely had to test out some retro gaming, and that's actually not all that I'm going to have coming up. I will have at least one more video coming up with this board. I do want to install Batocera or RetroPie on this unit and just see how it performs like that. AMD actually offers really great drivers for this little APU when it comes to Linux, and I cannot wait to get that up and running. But since it already had Windows 10 installed on it, I figured I'd go ahead and test that out first. If there's anything else you want to see running on this tiny Ryzen powered x86 single board computer, just let me know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more about it, I will leave a link to their website in the description. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. And like always, thanks for watching.